I didn't want it to just be like a divorce album. I want it to be a relationship album because it starts off, you know, you'd never want your kid in this relationship. Like, I would want better for them. I want better for my ex. I want better for us all.
What kind of fortune could leave a family in tears instead of comfort? When Kelly Clarkson's ex, Brandon Blackstock, passed away, the headlines weren't about his life, but about the staggering wealth he left behind. Courtroom battles, hidden debts, and a Montana ranch draining money by the month turned his legacy into a heartbreaking puzzle. Stay with us as we expose the shocking truth about the fortune that made his family cry. From Nashville roots to Hollywood shadows. For Brandon Blackstock, the story begins long before his name was tied to Kelly Clarkson or the Montana ranch that would later define his final years. His earliest years in Fort Worth, Texas, carried the weight of a legacy he didn't choose but could never fully escape. Brandon was born into the orbit of country music royalty. His father, Narvel Blackstock, was not just a figure in the business but a man who wielded real influence. Narvel had guided careers of stars like Blake Shelton and Reba McEntire, creating a reputation as someone who could turn artists into household names. When Narvel married Reba, the connection solidified Brandon's place in a world where celebrity and industry were part of the family dinner table. As Reba's stepson, Brandon witnessed firsthand the blend of glamour and pressure that came with life in the spotlight. These surroundings carved a particular path for him. While others his age explored ordinary teenage rites of passage, Brandon was absorbing lessons in tour logistics, artist management, and the cutthroat negotiations that kept careers alive. The Blackstock household was not a place for dreamers but for doers. It was a training ground where Brandon watched how deals were made, how reputations were protected, and how even the brightest stars had to work relentlessly to stay relevant. His adolescence wasn't about chasing microphones or stages. Instead, he leaned toward the quieter but equally demanding side of entertainment, management. For him, the thrill wasn't in applause, but in pulling the strings that allowed others to shine. Many insiders would later say Brandon had a natural instinct for spotting talent, even though he preferred to work outside the spotlight. This background also exposed him to the exhausting pace of the industry. Travel, long nights, endless schedules, and the constant demand for perfection were everyday realities. It wasn't unusual for Brandon to spend holidays or weekends not with family outings, but around artists and executives plotting their next moves. It created both opportunity and weight. He had privilege but also expectation, and the question lingered: would he match his father's accomplishments or be overshadowed by them? As he entered adulthood, Brandon began carving his own path as a music manager. He worked with big names, leveraging the contacts and know-how inherited from Narvel. He was present at rehearsals, behind the scenes at concerts, and in the rooms where deals were struck. One of those industry connections would eventually bring him into contact with Kelly Clarkson, though at the time she was simply another rising star. His career was steady but never loud. He seemed to prefer being the man behind the curtain rather than center stage. Yet, despite his inherited advantages, Brandon carried a quiet pressure to step outside of his father's shadow. In Nashville, names meant everything, and Blackstock was one that immediately raised expectations. Friends recalled that Brandon often downplayed the connection, not wanting to be seen as riding coattails. He wanted to be respected in his own right, though the reality was that family connections were both his strongest asset and his most limiting factor. The combination of privilege and pressure shaped Brandon into someone who understood both the rewards and the dangers of fame. He had seen stars soar and stars fall, sometimes in the same season. This dual perspective would later play a critical role in how he handled relationships, finances, and eventually his own identity outside the music world. But the boy who grew up watching superstars from the sidelines wasn't destined to remain in the shadows forever. A chance meeting years later would pull him directly into the center of fame, binding his story to one of pop's brightest voices. The path he had learned to navigate carefully would suddenly collide with a whirlwind of love, fortune, and the beginnings of a life few could have predicted. What fairy tale moment would transform Brandon from industry insider to the groom of America's sweetheart? Stay with us to uncover the details. The fairy tale wedding that hid cracks. It began with a moment that seemed too perfect to question. In the rolling hills of Tennessee, under autumn skies, Kelly Clarkson and Brandon Blackstock pledged a future that felt like it belonged in a movie script. The date was October 20th, 2013, and the venue, Blackberry Farm, was as picturesque as any celebrity could dream. Every detail whispered luxury and intimacy, rustic elegance, candlelit tables, and the presence of family who believed they were witnessing a love story built to last. The wedding was more than a union of two people. It was a blending of worlds. Brandon brought two children from his first marriage, Savannah and Seth, while Kelly entered with the dream of creating a home life more stable than the one she had grown up in. Soon they would welcome River Rose and Remington Alexander, turning the pair into a family of 6. For Kelly, this was not just marriage, it was her chance to rewrite the story of her childhood, to finally plant roots in a life defined by harmony rather than division. Behind the glitter of vows and photographs, however, the dynamics of power began to weave themselves into the relationship. Brandon, already experienced in guiding the careers of others, stepped into the role of Kelly's manager. To the public, it looked like a partnership of equals. She, the global superstar, he, the grounded strategist. But beneath the surface, the lines between husband and manager blurred, creating a delicate balance that would later prove impossible to maintain. Their home life stretched between two very different worlds. In Los Angeles, Kelly filmed The Voice and built her talk show empire, while in Montana, the family purchased a sprawling ranch that promised privacy and quiet away from flashing cameras. At first, the dual settings seemed ideal, one foot in stardom, the other in seclusion. Yet those close to the couple noticed subtle shifts. For Brandon, the Montana land offered sanctuary, a slower pace where his voice carried more authority. For Kelly, Los Angeles was the arena where her creativity flourished and her independence remained intact. Even as the relationship appeared unshakable to outsiders, small signs hinted otherwise. Friends whispered that Brandon preferred retreat, while Kelly thrived in connection. He leaned toward ranching and rodeos, she toward music, audiences, and relentless schedules. These weren't just lifestyle choices, they were visions of the future pulling in opposite directions. The couple's public image, however, told another story. Photos from red carpets, cheerful interviews, and social media posts painted a picture of stability. Kelly often spoke of how grounded Brandon made her feel, while fans swooned over their chemistry. The truth was harder to detect. Behind the polished images lay the early fractures of a partnership trying to be both personal and professional at once. The wedding itself had created expectations that weighed heavily. Kelly was no stranger to public scrutiny, and now every choice, every performance, every family decision seemed magnified by her marriage. Brandon, meanwhile, carried the less visible but equally heavy expectation of supporting a star whose career towered over his own. The balance of fame and support was tricky, and every step forward seemed to test their bond in ways neither had anticipated when they said, "I do." What looked like a picture-perfect beginning soon became a symbol of the challenges they couldn't quite escape. For Kelly, the marriage offered glimpses of stability she had long craved. For Brandon, it became both an anchor and a weight, tying him to a life where the public expected perfection even when reality whispered otherwise. What moment would shatter the illusion and reveal that this storybook marriage was not immune to collapse? Come with us to find out more. Divorce that turned into a battlefield. The silence of a home can reveal more than arguments ever could. By mid-2020, that silence inside the Blackstock Clarkson household was deafening. The pandemic had forced families everywhere to remain behind closed doors, and for Kelly Clarkson and Brandon Blackstock, that confinement magnified the cracks that had been quietly spreading for years. What the world saw as a strong, blended family began unraveling one conversation, one disagreement, and one moment of distance at a time. When Kelly filed for divorce in June of that year, the shockwaves were immediate. Fans who had once celebrated their fairy tale union struggled to reconcile the reality of separation. Headlines didn't simply frame it as a breakup, they called it a collapse. What made the news even more explosive was the fact that the divorce wasn't simply about two people growing apart. It quickly turned into a battle over finances, custody, and identity. Court documents told a story no Instagram post ever could. Kelly's empire was vast, built on years of relentless work, sold-out tours, television contracts, and her flourishing talk show. Brandon, on the other hand, was caught in a transition. He had begun to step away from the entertainment world, placing more of his energy into Montana life, while Kelly's career only continued to expand. That imbalance of earnings was destined to become the heart of the conflict. What followed was less a divorce and more a drawn-out negotiation under a public microscope. Every filing seemed to spark another headline. The most explosive revelation came when the court ordered Kelly to pay nearly $200,000 a month in combined spousal and child support. For outsiders, the number was staggering. To those within their circle, it was proof of how deeply tangled their personal and professional lives had become. But the money was only part of the story. The couple's children became central to the legal fight. Kelly wanted primary custody in Los Angeles, citing her demanding schedule and stability, while Brandon argued for the Montana ranch, which he saw as the family's true home. The ranch became more than land. It was a symbol of control, of who would hold the narrative of the family's future. As months stretched into years, the divorce proceedings resembled a saga rather than a resolution. Each side appeared determined to protect not just assets, but dignity. Brandon's reliance on spousal support became fodder for online debates. Some painted him as clinging to Kelly's fortune, while others defended him as a man trying to rebuild after stepping out of her professional shadow. Meanwhile, Kelly faced criticism of her own. Although admired for her talent and candor, some questioned her decision to pursue legal action against Brandon's family company, Starstruck Management. Her lawsuit alleging overcharging and conflicts of interest only deepened the rift. To onlookers, it was no longer about love lost. It was about power, accountability, and the fallout of blurring marriage with business. The divorce also reshaped Brandon's public image. Once seen as Kelly's quiet supporter, he became a figure of intrigue, even resentment, in the tabloids. Stories dissected his every move, portraying him as either a victim of a powerful spouse or as a man exploiting her success. The truth, as always, was far more complicated, buried beneath legal filings and carefully worded statements. What made this divorce so unforgettable wasn't just the numbers or the courtroom drama. It was the sense that both had entered their marriage believing it was unshakable, only to discover that even the most carefully crafted lives can unravel under the weight of expectation, money, and ambition. What would happen when Brandon stepped away from the spotlight of courtrooms and chose instead to stake his future on land, livestock, and a dream far removed from Hollywood? Stay with us to know what really happened. The Montana Gamble. The sound of wind sweeping across wide-open fields can be both liberating and isolating. For Brandon Blackstock, Montana wasn't simply a place on a map. It became a gamble for reinvention, a wager that he could carve a new identity far from the fame-soaked world he had known. After the divorce dust began to settle, he turned to the ranch as if it were more than land. It was a blank canvas on which he could attempt to paint a life entirely his own. The property itself was vast, stretching across rolling acres with a backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. On paper, it looked idyllic: stables, pastures, and a house designed to keep the family away from paparazzi lenses. But ranching, unlike the business of managing singers, required more than connections and ambition. It demanded constant physical work, endless expenses, and the willingness to endure unpredictability. Reports soon surfaced about the staggering cost of maintaining the estate. Nearly $80,000 a month went into keeping the property afloat. Staff salaries, equipment, taxes, livestock care, and the sheer upkeep of sprawling land. To outsiders, it seemed unsustainable. To Brandon, however, it was proof that he could live on his own terms, away from Hollywood's shadow. The ranch wasn't just an address, it was his declaration of independence. Yet independence often comes with sacrifice. Friends close to him observed that Brandon carried a mix of pride and stubbornness when it came to the ranch. Even as financial strain became apparent, he refused to let it go. For him, the land represented more than ownership, it symbolized dignity. Walking away would have meant admitting that life after Los Angeles wasn't as stable as he wanted the world to believe. Beyond finances, the ranch also gave him something intangible: moments of intimacy with his children. During their visits, River Rose and Remington could ride horses, explore wide open trails, and spend time without cameras following their every move. For Brandon, Those days became the highlight of his new existence. In the quiet of Montana, he could shed the image of Kelly Clarkson's ex and simply be a father. Still, whispers followed him. Critics speculated whether the ranch was truly his achievement or whether it was propped up by the financial support ordered during the divorce. Online forums debated whether he was chasing a dream or clinging to a lifestyle beyond his means. Every headline about his fortune circled back to the land, asking the same question: was this property a foundation or a trap? His efforts to make the ranch profitable extended into rodeo events, livestock auctions, and attempts to turn the estate into more than a private escape. These ventures reflected his determination, but they also revealed how difficult it is to pivot careers mid-life. Ranching required a kind of expertise he hadn't fully cultivated, and missteps came with expensive consequences. Despite the challenges, Brandon's attachment to Montana never wavered. He saw the wide skies and rugged terrain not as obstacles, but as opportunities to step into a life that felt authentic. To those who visited him, it was clear that the land wasn't just about wealth or image. It was about proving that he could stand apart from the legacy of his father and the towering fame of his ex-wife. Yet the gamble carried risks larger than financial ones. With every passing year, the ranch consumed more resources and more of his energy. It was a pursuit that walked the line between freedom and ruin. And while the fields and barns looked peaceful to outsiders, inside the accounts and contracts was a different story, a precarious balance that couldn't last forever. What would happen when the fortune tied to Montana collided with lawsuits, debts, and a reckoning that questioned everything he had built? Come with us to see what lies ahead. Fortune built on shifting sand. Wealth often looks solid from the outside, but when examined closely, it can crumble like sand slipping through fingers. For Brandon Blackstock, the fortune left behind became a puzzle of contradictions. Headlines painted him as a man who had secured millions, yet those who peered closer saw numbers tangled in lawsuits, repayments, and assets that were anything but liquid. His financial story was never as simple as the dollar sign suggested. At the height of his post-divorce settlement, Brandon seemed financially secure. A Los Angeles court had ordered Kelly Clarkson to provide nearly $200,000 a month in combined child and spousal support. To outsiders, this figure suggested stability, a lifeline that would keep the Montana dream alive. But such arrangements rarely remain untouched, and beneath the surface, obligations and disputes chipped away at that supposed security. In 2023, one of the most significant blows struck. Brandon was required to repay Kelly $2.6 million, a judgment tied to contested commissions and contractual disagreements. This wasn't just a financial setback. It was a public reminder that his fortune wasn't built entirely on firm ground. For many, the revelation turned the narrative upside down. Was he truly a man of wealth, or was he living in a fragile balance between income and debt? Adding to the complication was the nature of his assets. Much of Brandon's estimated $10 million net worth was not in cash, but tied to real estate and business ventures. The Montana ranch, while vast and valuable on paper, drained resources rather than generated them. Livestock, rodeo events, and land holdings carried prestige, but they weren't easy to convert into quick financial relief. Every acre represented both potential and liability, blurring the line between prosperity and pressure. Even his earnings from past years in entertainment management were not straightforward. While his time in Nashville had brought him connections and income, the shift away from that industry meant he no longer had steady streams flowing in. Without new artists under his wing or tours to manage, his reliance on settlement money and ranch ventures became sharper. Each month felt like walking a financial tightrope. Public perception fueled the drama further. Tabloids often inflated his fortune, portraying him as a man sitting on piles of money. Yet those close to the family described a different reality. The wealth was layered, complicated, and sometimes overshadowed by mounting responsibilities. To them, the fortune wasn't a glittering treasure chest, but a patchwork of income, debts, and obligations stitched together by court rulings. This complexity also weighed heavily on his family. Relatives and children were left not with a clear inheritance, but with questions. What of the ranch's future? What of the debts still tied to his name? To some, the fortune felt more like a mirage, a sum that looked impressive when headlines screamed numbers, but in reality carried as much burden as comfort. The emotional weight of such a fortune cannot be underestimated. For those left behind, it was not just about money. It was about the legacy of a man whose financial journey had been marked by both privilege and struggle. His name was forever linked to one of pop music's most public divorces, and even in death, the conversation around him circled back to dollars and cents. But behind the headlines about money lay another secret, one that he kept hidden until the end. What private battle consumed him while the world focused on his finances? Let us tell you. The secret struggle behind closed doors. From the outside, Montana offered sweeping skies, endless fields, and the appearance of peace. But within the walls of Brandon Blackstock's private world, a far heavier reality was unfolding. While newspapers obsessed over the fortune and the fallout of divorce, he was quietly waging a battle that had nothing to do with money. It was a fight against time, against his own body, and against an illness few knew he carried. For 3 years, Brandon lived with malignant melanoma, one of the most aggressive forms of skin cancer. It was not a diagnosis that appeared in glossy headlines or celebrity gossip columns. Instead, it remained tucked away, shared only among those closest to him. In an age when almost every detail of celebrity life finds its way to social media, his ability to shield this reality was unusual. It spoke to his determination to keep some parts of his life untouched by public consumption. The illness demanded treatments that were grueling and uncertain. Appointments, tests, and therapies became part of his routine, even as he tried to keep up the facade of normalcy. Friends described a man who continued to ride horses with his children and attend to ranch duties, even when his strength faltered. To Brandon, the choice to live as though life were unchanged was not about denial, but about giving his kids memories untainted by hospitals and worry. The secrecy also revealed a complex relationship with vulnerability. For a man who had spent years under the shadow of celebrity marriages and lawsuits, admitting weakness may have felt like surrendering control. In keeping his illness private, he maintained authority over at least one chapter of his story, even as other parts, finances, reputation, public image, were debated by outsiders. Those who visited him in Montana during this period often noticed subtle changes: a quieter demeanor, a thinner frame, a fatigue that was brushed aside with excuses about work or stress. Few pressed him, either out of respect or an unspoken understanding that he wanted normalcy more than pity. Even his children, still young, likely understood only fragments of what their father was enduring. The contrast was striking. Online, Brandon was often painted as the man embroiled in financial battles or clinging to the remnants of fame. In reality, his private world revolved around surviving one more day, one more season, while shielding the harshness of his condition from public view. It was a dual existence, one where the noise of speculation masked the silence of real struggle. Cancer does not only erode the body, it reshapes relationships. Those closest to Brandon found themselves drawn into moments of unexpected tenderness. Conversations that once centered on property or schedules shifted to simple expressions of love. The man who had fought to be seen apart from his famous ties was, in those moments, not a manager, not an ex-husband, but simply a father, brother, and friend confronting the fragility of life. As the disease advanced, choices became fewer. Treatments that once held promise grew less effective, and the reality of mortality pressed in. Yet even then, Brandon resisted becoming a public story of illness. No carefully crafted statement, no media announcement, just the quiet decision to let his final months unfold in private. It was a choice that gave his family space to grieve without the added glare of commentary and speculation. By February 2025, the silence surrounding his condition broke when news of his death emerged. He was just 48. The shock rippled outward, not only because of his age, but because so few had realized what he had been enduring. The world had been watching the wrong story, chasing fortunes while missing the quiet courage of a man fighting in the shadows. What legacy could remain after such secrecy? Was it the fortune, the land, or the memories he built in his final years? Come with us to know. Legacy of love or fortune of tears? When the news of Brandon Blackstock's death reached the public, the immediate response was a mixture of grief and disbelief. At only 48, his story had ended far sooner than anyone expected. But as tributes began pouring in, another narrative quickly followed, the question of what exactly he had left behind. For his family, the loss was measured not in dollar signs, but in the absence of a father, son, and friend. Yet the outside world couldn't resist asking whether the fortune often tied to his name would secure or complicate his legacy. Funeral services were held in Fort Worth, Texas, at First Baptist Church. The gathering was somber, marked by both tears and stories of Brandon's devotion to his children. His teenage son, Seth, honored him publicly, describing him as both a hero and a best friend. For Kelly Clarkson, the loss meant postponing her Las Vegas residency to remain with their 2 children, ensuring they were sheltered from the storm of media attention. In those first days, grief overshadowed everything else, and the weight of the moment silenced even the most vocal critics. But the silence didn't last. Soon, conversations about Brandon's financial state resurfaced. Reports estimated his net worth at around $10 million, a figure that seemed impressive until examined more closely. Much of that value was locked in real estate, ranch property, and business ventures. Unlike liquid assets, these holdings were difficult to distribute quickly. The Montana ranch, though beautiful, carried maintenance costs that made it as much a burden as a blessing. For a family already dealing with loss, the property was a double-edged sword, both a symbol of his dreams and a reminder of how fragile those dreams had become. Complicating matters further were outstanding obligations. The repayment of $2.6 million to Kelly in 2023 had already revealed how fragile his financial situation could be. Debts, ongoing costs, and legal entanglements meant that what remained for his family was far less clear than headlines suggested. Some insiders quietly admitted that the fortune might shrink considerably once taxes and liabilities were addressed. For his loved ones, this uncertainty deepened the pain, transforming grief into worry about the future. Yet legacy is never just about numbers. For his children, the memories of weekends riding horses, exploring the Montana landscape, and sharing private moments with their father are worth more than any estate. Friends close to Brandon describe him as someone who lit up most when surrounded by family. Even in the most difficult times, those recollections now form a more enduring inheritance, one of presence and love rather than possessions. Still, the public fascination with wealth lingered. Tabloids speculated over whether his assets would be tied up in legal disputes, whether Kelly would become involved in settling financial matters, and how his older children from his first marriage would fit into the picture. The debate created a stark contrast. While those closest to him grieved a man, strangers dissected his estate as though it were a puzzle to be solved. Kelly herself remained largely silent in the aftermath. Her restraint spoke volumes. She had shared a decade of life with Brandon, years filled with both joy and bitter legal battles. To issue a sweeping statement would have risked reopening wounds. Instead, she appeared focused on protecting her children and shielding them from the noise surrounding their father's passing. And in that quiet, her actions seemed to say more than any press release ever could. The real legacy he left behind was not counted in millions, but in the lives of the children they had raised together. Which part of Brandon Blackstock's story struck you most? Was it the staggering costs of the Montana ranch, the hidden battles behind his fortune, or the uncertainty his family now faces? Share your thoughts in the comments below.